Okay, thank you very much for joining us tonight here at Deer Run Public Library. I'm glad you're able to join us. I'd like to welcome Matt Singer. Uh, uh, he's the editor, and you're the editor and writer of Screen Crush, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, and then president of the New York Films Critics Association.
The New York Film Critics Circle. I'm the current chair is the official hoity-toity title. Yeah.
Yeah. So you'll have your awards ceremony coming up in a few weeks. But
Yes.
anyway, so I want to welcome you for a great book, Opposable Thumbs. So glad you're here. Just wanted to make an announcement or two beforehand that we'll be having next week. We'll be talking with David Zucker and Jim Abrams about his book Surely You Can't Be Serious on Tuesday, November 7th at 6:30. So if you're interested, please sign up and enjoy it.
I'm interested. I might show up to listen to that.
Yeah, just grab a virtual because we got an article in the paper, and the registrants are boom went way up. So, and it's great books, and yours is a great book too. So I'm glad you're joining us. So I could relate to very much how you described how you stayed up and watched Siskel and Ebert show in the middle of the night with the sound low, and hopefully your parents didn't hear you.
Yes.
I hear you. I mean, I discovered sneak previews when it was on its PBS run. I believe it was Thursday here in Detroit, and I just when did you first start watching Siskel and Ebert?
So for me, that would have been in the early 90s. This is when they had left PBS and they had gone into syndication. And then they had left their first syndicated show, which was called At the Movies, and started a second syndicated show at Disney. And that was the one that became known as Siskel and Ebert. And that was when I was watching it. Yes, in the early 90s was when I really remember really becoming obsessed with it. I don't really remember, how I found the show, what first got me interested in it. I just know that by that age, 12, 13 years old, I really was just weirdly fixated on this show about these two guys talking about movies. And I would, as you were saying, I wrote about I think in the acknowledgments of the book, I would stay up late. I would lie to my parents that I say I was going to sleep. Good night, Mom and Dad. Good night, Matt. And I would go to my bedroom and I would turn off the lights and I would lay quietly in bed, but not go to sleep. I would force myself to stay awake. And then hopefully my parents would be going to sleep before like midnight on Sundays is when I remember really the time that was the hardest to watch, to stay up for. Sundays at midnight on Fox 5, because I was growing up in suburban New Jersey. And that was the channel I remember it being on.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, yeah, and I was just at around, at 11:59, I would turn on the TV at the lowest volume and hope my parents wouldn't catch me watching Siskel and Ebert. Luckily, they never did. I got away with it. They never found out until many years later that I was doing that when I wrote about it for the first time. I think I mentioned it in an article, maybe when Roger Ebert passed away or something like that. I wrote about it. They were very upset. They were like, "What? How dare you?" They tried to you're grounded now. And I was like, I'm an adult. I don't live with you. I'm a grown man now, so you can't ground me. But now they're okay with it. Now that it resulted in a book, and it's okay. But yes, they were shocked that I did this.
Yeah, at least for me, it was their show really introduced me to a lot of things, a lot of directors, a lot of films that I wouldn't, uh, because foreign film distribution was pretty prevalent, at least here in Detroit. But it really opened my eyes to a lot of things. Did it have the same effect for you?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's the kind of funny thing about saying that I was obsessed with it at 12 years old. It wasn't that I was obsessed with movies at 12 years old. I was obsessed with Siskel and Ebert. It was becoming interested in the show was what made me interested in movies. And I went to movies like any kid goes to the movies, but I'm growing up in suburban New Jersey. So I don't have a cool art house theater to go to. I'm seeing whatever's playing at the Freehold Metroplex or Movie City 5. Those were the movie theaters I was going to, and they're showing Hollywood stuff. And it was Siskel and Ebert that really got me interested in, instead of when I would go to the local video store, instead of renting the big movie that had just come out on video, I would rent, the things that they were talking about on home video picks, Citizen Kane, 12 Angry Men, Casablanca, these now obviously very sort of film 101 kind of titles, but when they were talking about those things, that was what inspired me to start to kind of go back and watch movies that were 10, 20, 30, 40 years old at that point, and really enjoyed it. And then I can remember when I got a little bit older and I was starting to, travel or go to college or whatever, when there would be episodes of the show where they would be talking about, more independent films. And I was somewhere, like I can remember a trip, I think it's the summer of '96, and I was on a trip in Rhode Island in Providence. And there was cool movie theaters there that were showing Train Spotting and Lone Star, two movies that they really loved and recommended on the show. And I went to see them specifically because they were recommended by Siskel and Ebert, and I loved both of them. And I can vividly talk about the experience. I could tell you where I sat in the theaters. I can tell you, I saw Lone Star at the Cable Car Theater in Providence, and I sat on the right side in the middle of the theater. The theater, I don't know if it's still around, but at the time it had these, instead of like theater seats, they had couches, old couches. And I remember I could describe the couch I sat on. And it was a very formative experience. And absolutely, it was all because of Siskel and Ebert. And, talking about the book now, getting out there and doing interviews and things. What's great is, I mentioned that I was, watching the show in secret from my parents. And it wasn't exactly the kind of thing that I was bragging about to the other kids at school. This was not one of those shows that on Monday morning, the kids are all, unpacking their book bags and saying, "Did you see Gene and Roger's conversation about Speed? Can you believe what they had to say about Die Hard 2?" That wasn't happening. We were talking about The Simpsons or Seinfeld or 100 other shows, but it was kind of a secret. This was a thing that I didn't really talk about. And now doing interviews and meeting people with the book, what I find is so many people have such a similar experience. They grew up watching the show. They grew up loving the show. The show inspired their love of movies. The show introduced them to movies. They were growing up, people have told me, I grew up in Montana, Billings, Montana. I grew up in suburban Pennsylvania. All these people who had, we all were growing up and kind of feeling like these weirdos who were kind of, the only people that were interested in this show and in movies. And what it turned out was we were all connected without realizing it by Siskel and Ebert. It's kind of wonderful to have that experience now and to realize how many, I thought I had this weird, unique story. And now I'm seeing how many people have a very similar experience. And it's really great.
Oh, I get you. I get you. It's, I mean, fortunately, there was a few people in my high school that I could discuss what was on Siskel and Ebert, but not certainly the majority, not by far. And so it's like you say, it's neat to find out that this we all have this connection and really didn't know it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I guess the natural thing would be getting the idea for the book. But I like how your wife commented, yeah, if you didn't do it, you'd be so mad if somebody else did.
Yes, that is true. She gets all the credit because despite loving the show and fully being obsessed with the show at a young age, and then after Gene Siskel passed away, I became a huge fan of Roger Ebert's On His Own, his writing specifically, and really him being a huge inspiration to become a film critic, a film writer, all those sorts of things. I got to a point where I've written a few other books and I was looking for a new project, but certainly it was something I had considered, but I was a little intimidated to do it, honestly, because again, the show means so much to me. Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert mean so much to me. They're writers and writers that influenced me greatly and I'm a huge fan of. And I'm sort of inviting comparisons to them that maybe I don't want to have happen. And so, I was putting together a list of topics for, possible ideas for books and that I was supposed to send to my agent. And before I sent it, I showed it to my wife and I said, here's what I'm going to send. What do you think? And she was the one who looked at it and said, why isn't Siskel and Ebert on here? Which it was not on that earlier list. And, I said, I'm a little intimidated. I don't know. What if I screw it up? What if I can't pull it off? And her response was, first of all, yes, you can do it. Stop, get over yourself. You're being you. She knows me very well. Maybe I was fishing for compliments. I don't know. But, and she said, if you don't write it, somebody else does, you're going to be pissed off that you didn't. And I was like, yes, you are right. I am that petty and small. And if I don't do it, you're right, I would regret it. So yes, she was kind of the person who gave me the kick in the pants, so to speak, to actually kind of dive into doing it.
Now, I've imagined researching and talking to people to use a very film phrase on how they got started was a very Rashomon like people remember things, have their own memories of it, and it may not be add up to, it'd be like 2 + 2 + 2 maybe equal 4 or 6 or whatever you think it is.
Yes, and actually that's something that is 100% part of the book, and if you notice that in there, I'm very glad because yes, what I found was somewhat I felt very appropriately because we're talking about Siskel and Ebert, a show that was based on disagreements and based on two men sometimes arguing and disagreeing very vehemently. There's a lot of disagreement in the story of Siskel and Ebert. There's disagreement about who created the show. There's disagreement about like who wanted to do the show and who didn't want to do the show. There's disagreement about certain very important events in the history of the show and the development of the show as the show evolved, who did what and when. And I tried in the book as best I could to kind of represent that. I felt it was very fitting for this topic if I embrace that. And if you read the book, you will see that there are times where people give very different accounts of the same event. They were both present. Multiple people are present for it and they remember it in totally different ways. And so, yeah, I thought that was very fitting for this subject to embrace that. And I tried wherever I could to really, present different people's memories. And, if they agreed, I certainly said that as well. But you do find with this subject, there are times where there are different stories. And I thought that was kind of a really fascinating element of especially Siskel and Ebert, that there would be these junctures where people don't necessarily see eye to eye, because what was Siskel and Ebert if not a show based around the idea of two people not always seeing eye to eye?
Well, the competitiveness was in their DNA because they were both, competitive journalists, for one for the Sun-Times, one for this Tribune, and they were always going, wanting to get the lead, the hot story. They were competitors, and it just and it kind of worked out for the best in the end.
Yeah, well, and eventually, yes, absolutely. That was a huge part of why the show worked, was they eventually, maybe not right away, they eventually figured out a way to take that that off-camera dynamic, or lack of a dynamic, because when they before the show, they really didn't have much of a sort of, I would say, personal relationship. Professionally, they certainly knew who each other was, but they barely spoke. They didn't like each other because they did see each other as, almost more than competitors, more like sworn enemies that they had to defeat in journalistic combat, in a sense. And when the show really clicked was when they figured out a way to kind of harness that energy and really bring it on camera. And if you watch a lot of the early episodes of the show, which I did as part of the research, you can kind of slowly see that evolve. Where in the early episodes, they're very stiff, they're kind of uncomfortable, they don't really have much of a connection, but that over time, they gradually kind of found a way to bring that kind of competitiveness and that back and forth. They were able to kind of bring that onto the show. And once they did that, that was when the show really started to take off.
Well, there's several iterations of the show. It first started off with what they called opening soon in the theater near you, and then they went to PBS and sneak previews. And yeah, you're right. You described how they were concerned about preciseness. I mean, sometimes the filming of the shows would take literally hours to do a simple half-hour show, but then as you described, they eventually said, no, let's go with the arguments. Let's go with the disagreements back and forth.
Yeah. So yes, that was kind of the light bulb moment, if you will, that they originally, they were very rehearsed in the early episodes, and the PBS station in Chicago where they worked really prided themselves on putting out a really professional, crisp product with very high production values and very well rehearsed and everything kind of to the letter. And Gene and Roger felt that maybe it was less important for the show to technically look perfect, or for their back and forth to be precise and with no flubs or ums or whatever, than it was to capture a really authentic conversation and debate. And that when they were able to sort of institute that idea, that we're going to have a real argument on camera, we're going to have a real conversation, we're not going to tell each other what we're going to say beforehand. They would try their best not to know what the other thought of the movie. And so they're being confronted with their opinion for the first time, which is why if they seem kind of thunderstruck or shocked, appalled, perhaps in some cases, that's because that's a genuine reaction. Sometimes they're really surprised and shocked that this person, this other across the aisle from them, had the temerity to like this movie that they thought was a piece of junk, or to think this movie that they really liked was a piece of junk. And so when they got to that place where they were able to record what they called a first take show, where they would try to do the whole show, sort of with as few pauses, with as few redos as possible, so that the show was fresh, it was authentic, which was a really important kind of key to their back and forth. Once they started to do that, that was when the show really started to work and it really started to take off.
Well, I remember one show where they took you through an average day, and I remember how they got out of the screening room and they purposely didn't talk to each other. I think it was Siskel. He says, "We don't talk to each other," into the camera as they are entering down the elevator from the screening room. because yeah, they didn't want to tell each other what they thought. Now, let's see, they were complete opposites as persons. Ebert essentially wanted to work towards being a professor, whereas Siskel, he's always out there taking chances, betting on horses, I think was, and he was waiting till the last minute to fill out his reviews. They were, totally two different people.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, in so many ways, for guys who were basically the same age, a couple of years apart, but grew up, certainly the same kind of generation, grew up in, the same part of the country. For such similar kind of backgrounds in that sense, they really were two very strikingly different people. And you mentioned just a few of the ways. Yeah, I mean, Roger Ebert was just famously could, bang out a review almost like magic. If you talk to the people who would witness him do it, he would just sit down at a typewriter originally or a computer, and in 30 minutes he could have a not just a finished review, but like a beautiful, perfect, eloquent, thought out review. And Gene Siskel would chip away at it and be late and always waiting until the last minute and procrastinating. And someone who worked on the show told me, I think, that he, when asked about this, as like, why are you always waiting until the last minute? He said, and perhaps not entirely jokingly, it's like, well, if you wait until the last minute, maybe, once in a while, you won't have to do it at all. Like that, you can kind of get out of some things if you wait until the last minute, which I thought was a great line. But yeah, and as you said, like Ebert grew up really clearly, like was kind of on a path to being some kind of writer. He was making his own homemade newspaper when he was in elementary school on like a toy printing press that he would hand out his little homemade newspaper, the Washington Street News. He handed it out to neighbors in his neighborhood. And then when he was in high school, he wasn't working for the high school paper. He was working for the local newspaper in town in Urbana, Illinois. And he won an AP award for sports writing. That wasn't an award for a student writer. It was an award for just local sports writing. And then he went to the University of Illinois, and he was the editor of the newspaper there. And yeah, I mean, he was, when he got the job at the Sun-Times, he was originally kind of paying his way through grad school or to get his PhD at the University of Chicago, and thought maybe he could be, like a professor of English. He also said like he thought maybe he could be a columnist, like a Royko or someone like that. But clearly sort of writing was kind of his destiny, it seems to me, at least. Whereas Siskel came, much later to it and had different aspirations. At one point thought he would be a lawyer, studied philosophy, which I think you can kind of see in his reviews, both of those elements. He sometimes feels like he's prosecuting movies to me when you watch his reviews. He's almost putting them on trial in a sense and presenting evidence for or against them in that way. And then he kind of found writing when he was in the Army Reserve and was sort of thrust. He was basically like given a choice of different things he could do. And it was like he could drive a truck or he could study journalism. And he was like, you know what, I think I'll study journalism. And he fell in love with it then. And when he got out of the Army, he got a job at the Tribune. He just kind of walked in off the street with his resume and talked his way into a job. So they were very different people. And I think that was, again, another part of their success is if they were the same person and they had the same taste, the show would have been, yeah, I like this movie. And the other one would have said, you're right, we agree, next movie. There would have been no disagreement. Part of what made the show work was that they saw movies so differently and that they had so many different ways to appreciate movies and to describe what they liked or didn't like. And so when they did agree on something, it really meant something because you were seeing two different viewpoints that were coming together. And when they didn't agree, there was plenty to discuss and debate in very entertaining ways.
Now, you you worked with Roger Ebert. I was it one of the iteration of the at the movies? Uh, can you describe working with him in person?
Yeah, it was yeah, so Siskel and Ebert was on television from the mid 70s to 1999. Gene Siskel unfortunately passes away. The show continued on with at first with Roger and guest hosts, then it became Roger Ebert and Richard Roper. It was called Ebert and Roper. And then unfortunately Roger had his own health struggles, and eventually he lost the ability to speak. And at that point, Disney, the owners of the show, tried several times to reinvent the show with new hosts. But then after a couple of years, they kind of gave up. And at that point, Roger was still around. He was still writing. He couldn't speak, but he was, in some ways, he had kind of evolved into this even larger than life figure because he was writing so much. He was writing online. He had his blog. He wasn't just writing about movies anymore. He wrote a cookbook. He did all these different things. And he and his wife, Chaz Ebert, decided to revive the show and they were kind of the producers. And that show was back at PBS. It was called Ebert Presents at the Movies. And in addition to the traditional format of people, hosts in a movie theater set talking about movies, they had guest critics do segments, contributing critics. And I was lucky enough to get to do a bunch of them. And I got to work with Roger Ebert on that. And it was a fabulous experience. I mean, as someone who grew up watching the show and idolizing both of those guys, to get to work with Roger, I mean, it was a dream come true, no question. And he was great. He was involved in all of it. I would basically, how it worked was, they would say, hey, we're ready to hear some new ideas for segments. Send us some pitches. And I would send ideas, and he and Chaz, sometimes other people on the staff, would say, yeah, we really like this idea. Send us a script. And, I would write up a script, and I would get feedback. And sometimes he would have ideas. Other times he would say, this is great. Go for it. You're on the right track. I love this, and for a dork like me who grew up loving the show, it doesn't get much better than to get an email from Roger Ebert saying, like after you send in an idea and he writes you back and says, you're just plain good, was one email he wrote me. That was the whole email. He said, you are just, in the headline or the subject line. And it said, you are just ... And when you opened it up, it said ... plain good. And I just remember sitting there and going like, all right, I don't have to do anything else now. If I never do anything else in my life in the world of film, that's going to probably be as good as it gets for me. I think maybe now that I've written this book, maybe I have done something else worthwhile. Excuse me. But that was a great moment. And again, kind of like what I said earlier about, I'm watching this show feeling very isolated, alone doing it, but lots of other people are having a similar experience. Lots of people can have stories like that about Roger Ebert. He was very generous with other up and coming film critics. I did a Q&A last night at a movie theater here in New York with Dana Stevens from Slate. And she told a story that when she was about that same age, in that middle school, maybe early high school age, she was a huge Siskel and Ebert fan herself. And she decided she wanted to be a movie critic. And she wrote Roger Ebert a fan letter. And he wrote her back and said, go for it. And gave her very good advice, suggestions. She kept the letter all these years. She wrote about it. She, if you Google her name and Roger Ebert, I'm sure it will come up. And she talked about how nice he was and what a mensch he was. And it was just sort of who he was in terms of, he was very encouraging of, other up and coming critics. And I think he did sort of appreciate the influence that he and Gene Siskel had. And he recognized it. And I think he really kind of took it seriously, where when people, looked to him, he was very encouraging in a way that was really, he didn't have to be. He certainly didn't have to be like that. And I think I think a lovely small part of his legacy is the way he treated people like me and Dana Stevens and many, many others.
Well, why don't I ask you about your website, Screen Crush? When did you get that started? And feel free to talk about it.
Well, I didn't start the website. I was actually brought in by a former colleague that I had worked with at another website, and he brought me in to be basically like the film critic, film writer at the time. And then not that long after he left, and not that long after that, other people, the world of journalism and websites being what they are, people got laid off, and kind of became a little one-man band over there for the last few years, with certainly some help and freelancers. And we have a great video team that does some really fun videos on YouTube. If you like watching videos about, movies and TV shows, they do great stuff. But yeah, I mean, my favorite thing to do still is write movie reviews. So any excuse I get, I do 100 other things day to day. It's kind of like, like administrative work and editing and blogging and all these sorts of things for the privilege of once or twice a week I get to write movie reviews, because again, I'm such a huge fan of not just movies, but film criticism. And again, that's something that dates back to falling in love with it, watching Siskel and Ebert. And then reading, like I said, reading Roger's reviews, his books. I have a whole shelf of Roger Ebert's books on my bookshelf here at home. So yeah, I mean, that's just, it's like I said, it's like anytime I get a chance to do that's the fun stuff to me about the job, is writing about movies. Like to me, it doesn't get much better than that.
Well, who do you read? What other critics do you read? It's so hard now because everything's so, there are a lot of voices out there, and I guess maybe we can talk about Siskel and Ebert's, whether or not they would have survived in this atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe like a two-part question, like how would they survive, and what critics do you read?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think they would have. I mean, this is something that I write about at the end of the book. Is sort of that question became something I thought a lot about. Is because they both passed away very young. I mean, Gene Siskel really. I mean, he was only 53 years old when he passed away. Roger passed away when he was 70. So not the youngest man in the world, but certainly not old, in my opinion. And Gene certainly was just unbelievably young, especially now that I'm a guy in my 40s. He might have seemed kind of old to me when I was watching as a kid, but now it's shocking to me. He was a relatively young man. He had little kids. It's just a tragedy. So it's something I think about, is if they had stayed healthy, like what would they be doing? And I asked almost everyone I spoke to doing my research, doing interviews. I would ask people like, what do you think they would be doing now? And again, it's Siskel and Ebert. There's disagreements. There's different points of view. I got a lot of different answers. It wasn't one singular answer to that question. Some people thought the show would have continued. Some people thought the show might have come to an end, not because of them necessarily, but because of, changes in the television landscape, and the syndicated TV business is a lot different now than it was in the early 80s. They were kind of in the perfect place and time to capitalize on the emergence of syndication when they jumped from PBS to syndication. But even if the show had gone away, other people said, and I tend to agree, it's like, they could have had the #1 film podcast in the world. I mean, to me, the Siskel and Ebert movie podcast, I would have been the #1 subscriber to that. I can't imagine a better podcast than that. I mean, the Siskel and Ebert show, as much as I loved it as a kid, it was, in the early days, it was 28 minutes with no commercials. And then later it was 22 minutes with commercials, and they're reviewing 4 movies, maybe even 5 movies in that time. So they don't have a lot of time to talk about any one movie, whereas a podcast can be 2 hours, 3 hours about one film. And I would have loved to have heard Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert get to do 2 hours on Killers of the Flower Moon. I mean, I think that would have been incredible. I think they would have thrived under those kind of circumstances. So I think they would have adapted. I think Roger certainly showed in his later years, he was a really, he was always kind of ahead of the curve with technology. He's an early adopter of computers and Macs. And then, he was one of the early users of Twitter who had hundreds of thousands of followers. He was always kind of great, and blogging, and he kind of got all that stuff. So I have a feeling they would have adapted very well. In terms of who I read, I mean, you mentioned in the beginning, I'm part of the New York Film Critics Circle. I think we have a lot of really wonderful members of our group. We've been growing the last few years. If you go to our website and look up the names in the group, there are some really wonderful people in there. And there's wonderful people who aren't in the group. I love reading Manohla Dargis in the New York Times. She's not a member of the group. The New York Times has rules against critics joining film critic groups like ours, any group, for whatever reason. It's against their company policy or whatever. So, I mean, she's not a member. I mean, we mentioned Dana Stevens earlier, just a few minutes ago. I love reading Dana Stevens. I mean, I could literally rattle off a lot of names, and I listen to a lot of podcasts as well. I mean, I think that podcasts about movies, I think there's some really wonderful ones out there. I mean, there's so many, it can be hard to know which ones to listen to and where to start, because as you said, there are so many voices, but there are some really great ones. And yeah, I mean, it's not the same as Siskel and Ebert. Generally, those podcasts are people who, they're friends. They want to be talking to each other. Usually they're people who would be having these conversations even if the microphones weren't involved, because they just like talking about movies and spending time with their hosts. That wasn't Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert. If the microphones weren't there, they might not have been talking together, because even when they became closer, they always had a kind of combative relationship. They were, they respected each other. They got along better. They kind of had this sibling relationship where they would love each other one minute and bicker the next. But they were, obviously their origin was this rivalry and competition, and they weren't necessarily friendly. And so there were often disagreements and fights. And that energy I don't find in a lot of podcasts, even the ones I enjoy. So it's a different thing, but I don't think it's necessarily a worse thing. It's just different.
Yeah. Like, for instance, I enjoy the Roger Deakins podcast, where he talks to different crew members, and it's fascinating to hear what their duties are, what they do on a daily basis, how a film set runs. But yeah, it's not, they don't argue or fight with each other. It's more of a great, nice, informative thing.
Yeah. And that can be great too. And like I said, you can get more in depth on a podcast than Siskel and Ebert very rarely could. I mean, the longest reviews they ever did were, maybe 10 minutes, or maybe once in a while they would do a special show where they would talk about one movie or one filmmaker for the whole episode, a whole episode on Tarantino or Scorsese or Spike Lee or something like that. And those are great. You can find them online, and I recommend them. But the standard review they're doing is about 5 minutes, and that includes clips from the movies. And so it's not going to be a 2-hour dissection of the minutia of every aspect of a film, the writing, the lighting, the compositions, the score, the mise en scène, the production design. And there are podcasts out there where they do get into that kind of level of, minutia. So I listen to a bunch of podcasts, and I'm always discovering new ones. I'm always excited to find new ones. And I love still. I mean, I'm an old person now. I still do enjoy reading film criticism as well. I still read, I still pull my Roger Ebert books off the shelf every now and then, just to kind of, for a little inspiration. I love his great movies book series, and those I think are really timeless, pieces. And I'll just pull one of them off and open to a random page and just read whatever I find. And I always find that like whatever I stumble upon there, I just will find 2 or 3 sentences even that just kind of, it's the kind of thing where it inspires you and it also makes you mad that you're not that good. But I suppose that's maybe, certainly Siskel and Ebert thought it was healthy to feel that you're competing with somebody, an ideal, something you're chasing, that sort of spirit makes you a better whatever you're trying to be. So perhaps that's maybe that's good for me to have that feeling every now and then. I don't know.
All right, well, let's go with one final question. Have you heard from the Siskel and Ebert families about the book?
Well, I spoke to Chaz Ebert and Marlene Iglitson, Roger and Jean's widows. I spoke to both of them for the book. And, I'm not sure if either one has read it yet. I've sent them both copies. But I have heard from some of the people I spoke with for the book, and so far the reaction from those circles has been very positive, which is very encouraging, and I'm really happy about. And like I said, the best part to me is that I've been speaking to a lot of people who share a variation of the story I told you about loving the show, almost kind of as like a secret thing. And hearing them say, I loved learning about things I didn't know about the show. Also, I loved reading the book with like it took me a while to read the book because I kept stopping to go to YouTube to watch episodes of the show, which is another thing that I absolutely was hoping people would do, because I did my best to kind of describe and put you to create as best I could in words the spirit of the show, of certain episodes, of certain arguments. But I did kind of hope it would get people to go and go down a YouTube rabbit hole of watching old episodes. You could say in some ways the show is dated in some ways, in some aspects. Certainly the fashions are dated, especially in the early episodes. And obviously, they're not producing new episodes. So we don't have Siskel and Ebert's thoughts on new movies. But what I think is really valuable about the show, beyond the fact that it's just fun and to watch episodes and, they argue and they have these great debates and it's entertaining, is I think the show represents this really valuable kind of it's like hundreds or thousands of snapshots of the movie world from 1975 to 1999. If you want to know what was going on in the movie scene at any point in that period, a great place to start is to go to the episode of Siskel and Ebert from a particular week. You will find out what movies were coming out. You will find out what they thought about them. You'll find out about like the actors they thought were interesting, the directors they thought were up and coming, or perhaps on the downward slope of their careers. I suppose that happens sometimes too. They talk about trends in the movies. They talk about technologies that are evolving. When the show debuted in 1975, nobody owned a VCR. VHS didn't exist. And you can watch home video be invented and evolve over the course of the show. And then laser discs are invented, and then DVDs are invented and introduced. One of the very last episodes of Siskel and Ebert, they talk about this emerging format called DVD. That was like late 1998, and the final episodes with Gene, at least, were in early 1999. And there's lots of other examples like that. And so I think it seems slightly crazy to do what I did, which is to watch basically every episode of the show in order, but it is a fascinating window into that quarter century of movies. And if someone is interested in that time period in movies, it really is a fascinating resource to have and to look at. And I, like doing the book, like that was one of the best parts of the research, of the writing, of any part of it, was just getting to revisit the show and to see how interesting it still is as a thing in 2023. it's surprisingly relevant in some ways. It's surprisingly useful in other ways. On top of the fact that I think is still just a really entertaining show to watch.
Yeah, indeed. I agree with that. So I want to thank you very much. And we're going to take some time now for some questions. A man in the audience here is really eager to ask a question. What did you want to do?
Can you hear me, man, or should I move up a little bit?
I think I can hear you.
Okay, well, I have just two questions, but as I was watching the show, I didn't take it the same way you did. I really took it for the reviews but mainly it was the arguing between the both. And I always felt Roger Ebert was a bit of a pompous ass. I always like Gene better. But when you were interviewing people for the movie, did you ever ask them which one they liked the most? I mean, not for the movie, for your book.
Yeah.
Ask which one you liked the most.
I didn't really ask that question. Certainly, when I speak to people now, I do hear, like you said, some people are Team Gene, some people are Team Roger. Personally, I never had a favorite. People ask me that question. Did you have a favorite? And certainly, as I mentioned, when I got a little older and I was really reading film criticism more and more, I was a huge Roger Ebert fan of his as a writer specifically. When I was a kid watching the show, I didn't have a favorite of one or the other. I always liked the show. And again, when revisiting it now for the book, I found I felt the same way. And I think for me, what I really loved about the show was I never felt like one or the other was more right or a better critic, a better debater. I always felt like it was they were evenly matched opponents. And I think that was part of the success of the show, in my opinion, was that they were very different, but they were both smart. They were, they kind of, by a certain point, they kind of knew each other's tastes, their debating strategies. It's almost like a chess match or a boxing match without punching. They're using words, and you watch them kind of jab at each other and kind of bob. And they're always, if you watch the show, they're always fidgeting in their seats and moving. And I started to see them as almost like boxers who, instead of using their fists, they were, kind of fighting with words. It's like 25 years of a show about people fighting, but they never get out of their seats. It's like a 25-year argument of two people sitting. A never-ending fight between two people who never got out of their chairs. That was a thought that I had that I think is probably somewhere in the book. I don't remember if I wrote it specifically in there or not, but that's certainly a thought that I had. But yeah, I didn't ask people as I was doing the research, did you prefer one or the other? And I certainly hear a lot of people tell me, I love Roger or I love Gene. And certainly that was a part of the show, is people did have their favorites. But for me, I remain sort of, I like the total package. And I think that it didn't, when after Gene passed away, I still watched Ebert and Roper, and I think Richard did under the circumstances, did a very good job, but I just never thought it was quite the same evenly matched two equal opponents, the heavyweight boxing match of 25 years. It just didn't have quite that same energy to me after Gene passed away.
So the second question is, I'm a hockey player, played all my life, still playing. But when Slapshot came out, I remember Roger gave it a thumbs up, and Gene gave it a thumbs down. And I thought to myself, man, I disagree with that. I disagree with with Gene, and I think Roger was spot on. And then just by coincidence, I guess, did they have a show at the end of the year where they could say, you know what, I really blew it on this call, when I said it was a thumbs down, and now I think it's a thumbs up, because I did see the show where Siskel came on and apologized to everybody and said, I blew it when I made the thumbs down call for Slapshot. I think this was like about 4 or 5 years later. He said, this is almost like a cult following now. This is a good movie and millions of people love it. So when I gave it the thumbs down, I blew that call, and I want to say sorry. It's a thumbs up now. Do you remember that one?
I don't know the exact specific episode, but I do know that they were often asked about, especially, because they were critics for decades, and then they would have, the 500th anniversary was the 500th episode. They did a lot of press around that, or, and they would be asked, have you ever gotten a movie wrong, or what reviews do you regret? And for sure, one of the movies that Siskel would specifically mention in that context was Slapshot. The other one he would sometimes mention is Apocalypse Now, that he also gave a thumbs, or at that time there were no thumbs, as a matter of fact. He gave it a no vote on PBS, the original version of the show. That there was no thumbs up and thumbs down. That came later. But he gave that a negative review, and he never became the biggest fan of that movie, but he would say that he would later admit he was maybe a little too hard on it, that it is a good movie. That he just was not, he didn't think it was a masterpiece, perhaps. But those were the two movies, when he would be asked that question, those are exactly the two movies he would always say in multiple interviews.
I must have seen that episode, because
right.
I clear as day, and I'm apologizing. Hey, thank you, Matt.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Let's see. A good question in Q&A. Are there any films released in the past 10 years since Ebert passed that you thought you would have loved to know Siskel and Ebert's thought on?
I mean, so many. I mean, I mentioned the new Scorsese movie earlier. Like, I would have loved to have seen or heard or read their review of that film. I mean, they were huge Martin Scorsese fans. I mean, I don't know what they would have thought of the movie. I think they would have just generally been very happy that Scorsese was still making films at 80 and still making challenging movies, and not just, phoning it in, not just making, something for the money. And I certainly would have loved to have heard their review of that film. But pretty much you name any interesting movie, it doesn't even have to be a movie that's, even universally praised, a movie that gets, that's divisive. To me, those would be the perfect movies to hear Siskel and Ebert from. But yeah, you name any movie from the last 10, 20 years, I would have loved to have heard their debate or perhaps argument over any of those movies. But one of the nice things about the show is also they could have an interesting conversation about sometimes the least interesting movies. I mean, their debates about dumb, stupid movies sometimes are just as interesting, because they find things to argue about, perhaps not even about the film, but they begin to take the conversation into debates of, philosophy, religion, politics, or just the very nature of criticism and what makes a movie good and what makes a movie bad, and how do we evaluate movies. It's another thing that I was really struck by watching the show again, was how often I was realizing that kind of on a subliminal level, when I was a kid watching this, I was learning how to be a critic without even realizing it, because they're debating how to evaluate movies, not just, well, this is good and this is bad. But when they're challenging each other, what they're really challenging is how each other is evaluating these movies and how they see the movies and why they like certain things, why they don't like certain things, why they rate certain elements more important than other elements, whether a movie is good if it's trying to do something very modest and achieves it, versus something that's very ambitious but maybe fails to achieve its ambitions. Which is better? Is it better for a movie to aim for the stars and fail, or for a movie to play it very safe and pull that off? Things like that. are the things that wind up becoming the fodder for discussions on the show. So yeah, I mean, I would happily, gladly watch any Siskel and Ebert review of any movie of the last however many years.
Matt?
We got one more question.
Okay.
That may be interrupted by a closing announcement.
Okay, this is quick for you. So I always wondered for critics like yourself, like an upcoming movie's coming out Thanksgiving, Napoleon, okay? Sure you know that. So for you, in a typical job situation, is how soon before the movie comes out do you get to see it? And then how many days before it comes out does it go to print in a newspaper or whatever format you're using?
Mm-hmm. It really depends on the movie and depends on the critic too, to be honest with you. I mean, critics for more prestigious publications or websites or with larger followings, they might be invited to see a movie earlier or than a critic who runs a blog or doesn't have as much of a following. Typically for a bigger, the big blockbuster movies, if the movie comes out on Friday, it's pretty standard that critics are going to get to see it probably the Monday or the Tuesday. That's pretty typical. Sometimes it can be the week before, perhaps. Sometimes it can be the day before a movie comes out. Often that's a case where, if maybe the movie is not that great and they know it, the studio knows they kind of have a crummy movie on their hands. They might wait until the last second because they don't want word to get out about the movie being a stinker. The studios, the publicists, they really, that's part of their strategy is when to show it to critics, who to show it to. They're trying their best, the best they can, to predict how it's going to do and to try to, sort of get the best possible reviews they can and to have them appear at the most advantageous time for them. In terms of your example of Napoleon, I haven't seen that movie yet, but there is a early screening of that coming up. I can't think of the date offhand, but I mean, that's sort of like what I was describing. I'm going to get to see it, maybe the week before it comes out, I guess. And then
please.
There we go. Announcement.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you.
Or mezzanine will close at 7:45 p.m. Public internet computers will begin shutdown procedures shortly. All documents should be saved immediately to email or an external device.
Oh.
Wish to register for a card, get periodical, or get change, please go to the appropriate desk now, as these services will end at 7:45 p.m. Thank you.
Oh, okay. So we close.
Better save your documents.
So I want to thank you very much, Matt. I honestly could talk to you for a long time about it, but as you heard, we're closing up shop. So you take care and thank you very much. And Matt's book is available at many places, especially Pages Bookstore and all online. And thank you very much. Hope you feel better.
Thanks. Thank you.